So we'll now hand over to our next speaker, Professor Martin Millett from Cambridge University. Is going to speak about the urban highlights from Britannia over the last, 50 years? Or
something like that, I hope.
Yeah.
Let's just try and get this to... Great. Well, thanks for the invitation. It's quite a daunting task. I accepted the invitation and then looked at it about 8 weeks ago and thought, God, that's quite a challenge. I should also add that I've sort of grown up with Britannia. I blagged my way into membership of the Roman Society in 1970 when I was 15. Patricia Gilbert was the secretary then, and was very generously bent the rules to allow me in. So Britannia 1 sort of was my first subscription, so this is quite a fun place to be. And what I want to do is to think briefly about where we were then and then where we are now. And the remarkable thing about where we were then in the early 1970s is just how small studies of Roman archaeology in Britain were. You could know everyone, I think. And in terms of the archaeology of towns, there had been a lot of work done in the post-war period by comparison with what had happened before. And in the excitement of the 1960s, people were beginning to draw that information together. So in terms of the towns, the conference in 1965 on the civitas capitals of Roman Britain was really state of the art, and it's worth looking at the contents of that to see what people were thinking about. And of course, the magisterial survey of Roman Britain that drew everything together, Shepard Freer's Britannia first edition, came out in 1967. So in some senses, the discovery of urban archaeology, which was really a mid-20th century phenomenon, was brought together for the first time in the late 1960s. And formed part of the background for understanding urban sites. But the evidence base that we had for that came from a comparatively small number of excavations and other projects on a comparatively small number of sites, largely dominated by 2 or 3 towns, Winchester, Verulamium with Shepard Freer's major thing, and I couldn't resist but include Cirencester here. Cirencester 1973, which is the first excavation that I supervised. Kate Owen, who used to be the Antiquaries editor, is one of the volunteers on the site there. I couldn't recognise any of the others, and the funny clothes that people wore made me realise just how old I'm getting. But it was a very narrow base, drawn largely on some set-piece excavations. There was a little bit of small-scale excavation on other sites, but not on a massive scale. Though it was beginning, of course, to take off in places like Gloucester and so forth. And that sort of 1960s, early 1970s drawing together of information came together and was expressed, although I think Waiter was expressing things that other people were saying, in what I see as a sort of naturalised consensus about towns in Roman Britain. Ideas around a rigid administrative hierarchy of different types of site, the role of the military and the state in stimulating urban development, and a very schematised chronological sequence which relates a lot of development to the Roman state and sees things taking place in quite a neat framework. It's also worth stating and picking up, in a sense, a point that Heller's making, that was a very insular framework. I'm going to come back to the fact that it's proved a very robust framework and hasn't really been questioned, but it doesn't work nearly as neatly in other provinces if you try and apply it as it appears to in Britain, and that might be something that we want to think about. But the other strength of that earlier part of the period Britannia was the real effort to draw together key reference works. And we are easily familiar with Roman inscriptions of Britain. I didn't put volume 1 on because the cover of it is so tatty on my bookshelves that it would have been a disgrace. And that sort of indicates how important it is. But having Roman inscriptions, the CSIR volumes, for all their sort of faults, the corpus of mosaics from 2000, Tom Blagg's work on architectural ornament, the place names, has given an underpinning to the subject, which I think ought to be the envy of other parts of the empire. If you go and try and do work in Spain, for instance, or France, the evidence simply hasn't been drawn together in the same way as people have done in Britain. And that gives, whatever we think of some of the problems of those reference works, it gives us a foundation for doing things which is difficult to parallel and is extremely important as a flagship for Roman archaeology in Britain. The other high point I would draw out is that since the 1970s, urban archaeology has become a sort of mainstay of archaeology. Not simply through the big research excavations that I'll come back to mention a little bit later, but through developer-led archaeology. And from the sort of work on Winchester with Biddle in the 1960s onwards, Britain has become a real leader in how to do urban archaeology and has led the way in our understanding of the process of digging an urban site and publishing it. And the quality of that work is something that we really ought to celebrate, and I don't think we celebrate that sufficiently. I too have been looking at proportions of what's been going on, and it's notable that, and I plundered some work that Jerry Evans did in 1990, which showed that if you go through the Roman Britain in 19 whatever survey, that 31% of sites between 1970 and 1989 are urban in the Roman Britain survey. Like Heller, I ran out of time for running that through to today, but I think it needs to be done. My impression is that the numbers remain very high. Neil may have some accurate figures for that from the work he's been doing. But we now turn to the some reflections against that. Sorry, the thing's rather pale. I too have been plundering the contents of Britannia, probably with slightly different categories from Heller. But against that, let's say 1/3 of all excavations on Roman Britain are on towns as a baseline, it's very interesting that the number of articles in Britannia that can turn stuff on urban archaeology are very, very limited. They never rise in any decade above about 8 to 10% of the papers in the journal. And as you break those down, you see some quite interesting changes that by and large they were all about public buildings and town planning in the early period, what else would we expect? Very little about debate, discussion and theory. As we run through time, they broaden out and finds town production come in. And notably, and rather gloriously, the fines thing is increasing through time. That's a product, in part, of the generation who are represented by people like Hella and Ellen here, who 10 or 15 years ago were saying, come on, we need to really give artefacts much more prominence in the study of Roman Britain. So that's the bit to celebrate. The bit that worries me, puzzles me and worries me, what puzzles me is, given that the whole understanding of urbanism in the Roman Empire is pitched around an enormous debate on the economy, production and the economy hardly appears at all in the journal in this sense. And debate, big questions about towns, again, hardly at all. So that's something to ponder. In part, I think that is a product of the diversification of the subject. Certainly, I treasure a letter from Shepherd Freer turning down a paper of mine for Britannia. There was an editorial view that certain things were acceptable in the journal and certain things weren't, and that sent people off to publish elsewhere. In the 70s and 80s, a lot of things got published in conference proceedings. Since the emergence of Trap, a lot of things have been published there. And interestingly, a lot of things that were turned down by Britannia, including mine, ended up in the Oxford Journal of Archaeology because they were much more responsive to slightly dodgy debate papers than Shepherd Freer was. If we think where we are now, as I say, excavation is big and is still there. Most of it, as we know, is commercially driven, done within different contexts. A lot of work has been done in trying to draw that evidence together, because what we all recognise is that it's rather fragmented and it's difficult to see the pattern. So the Roman Society publication a couple of years ago on the towns of Roman Britain, drawing the commercial evidence together, is great. It's fulfilling part of... We need to recognise that if you just take like for like, there are probably fewer big research excavations like Silchester now than there were in 1970. That may be a good or a bad thing, but it represents a big change in the subject. And given that those big research excavations acted as a way of sort of generating some of those ideas that came through into synthesis around that time, I think there may be a connection between where the evidence is coming from and how the subject is or isn't changing that is worth reflecting upon. Those of you who know me will be aware that I'm a great fan of excavation. I think it's fantastic. I enjoy doing it, but I don't think it particularly works well for urban sites. And I think one of the big changes we've seen is the revolution in archaeological geophysics, which for urban sites I think is fantastically important, because it gives you a holistic view of the urban landscape rather than a pinhole you can get through excavation. There have been some really big surveys. The Roxter one was the one that first did to the whole town. There are others here. I realised when I was looking at this that I hadn't included Chris Lockyer's work at St Albans as well. But people are bringing this together. I have to say that the technology of gathering the data hasn't always been followed up with thoughtful and useful publication of it. It's, wow, look at that plan, not, hang on a minute, what does that mean, that is the issue. But I do think that this is one of the really big areas where we have seen change and we will see a lot more change. And just to tantalise you on that, gradiometry, magnetometry, moved in the 1980s from I can do an area the size of this room to I can do a whole town side. We have just finished doing 2 whole Roman towns with high resolution radar in Italy at 12 centimetre intervals. And the results are absolutely jaw-dropping. They're fantastic. And when you think, what might we get out of a site like Rochester or Silchester with really high-resolution radar work, I think we're on the where we were in the 80s with magnetometry. So that's an area which I would be encouraging and seeing as a future highlight. The other area which I think has been very important, but perhaps hasn't had the profile that it should, is the initiative that began with English Heritage way back in the 1990s, I think largely under the impetus of Roger Thomas, to draw together urban assessments. The first of those that was published that dealt with a Roman site was the Cirencester one, and others have gradually been emerging. And these are major works of reference. They are extremely useful in drawing together the data and doing that cross period. So they're not just about the Roman, they're trying to see the Roman in its broader context. They are extremely data heavy. They're not the sort of thing that you will, well, you may go to sleep reading them in bed, but they're not the sort of thing that you're likely to go to bed reading. The Winchester one, be where you strain my arm sort of reading it. What I would say is that they are massive works of data collection. They're not very revolutionary in what they've done with the data. And I think that's, again, something that is well worth thinking about. By contrast, there are beginning to be a few academically driven syntheses that don't necessarily set out to synthesize in the same way as the urban assessment volumes. I've sort of noted 2, John Crichton, Rob Fry's Silchester, and Lacey Wallace's Origins of Roman London, both of which have sought within bounds to draw all the evidence together and try and understand it as a sort of question-driven academic problem. Lacey's work on pre-Boudiccan London really does change the understanding of that and shift things away from old models. And John's work on Silchester, which is based on large-scale geophysics and integrating that with the past excavations, again, I think makes some extraordinarily interesting new ideas available on the origins and early development of Silchester. What I would say with those is, although both of them draw on artefact and to some extent ecological and environmental evidence, they are primarily topographically driven, and they haven't cracked, if you like, the problem of integrating on a large scale finds assemblages from sites. And that's got to be one of the challenges if we're going to move forward with urban archaeology in the next few years. That's not to say that fantastic work hasn't been done on finds, And in many ways, when you stand back from it, the big change in the last 50 years is that people are thinking about fines and what they can do for our understanding of urban sites, rather than just as sort of illustrations in an appendix at the back of a volume of some pretty things that we discovered. Fundamental to that have been the thinking about the categorisation of fines and thinking about what they mean in terms of people's lives, pioneered, of course, by Nina Crummy and developed by a whole range of others. And the other trend that I think is important to draw out, not only in small fines, and I embarrass Hella by putting her lamps work up here, thinking about fines, what types of site they come from, what the profiles of an urban assemblage as opposed to a rural assemblage and so forth are. That is a trend that has come through not only with lamps here, various categories of small fines and so forth, but also with work for people like Jerry Evans and Steve Willis on pottery assemblages. My only concern about that is that they work generally from the preconception that the categories of sites that were part of that sort of Waite synthesis are correct and the right types to be dealing with. And I think that is something that we might want to debate. Understanding urban origins has also been fantastically successful. And work at places like Colchester and Verulamium have begun to change our simplified understanding of that. I think there's a lot more to do there, but it's an area of success rather than concern. Where I do have some, not worries, but something of a downside is if I think that when a number of us were thinking about urban sites in the 1970s and 80s, we were thinking about the relationship between town and country, what's become sort of hinterland studies. There was a rash of studies of things like pottery distributions trying to understand them. They suddenly became very unfashionable and dropped out. There was a lot of work being done on bones and seeds. A lot of that's continued, but it hasn't been drawn together, it hasn't been integrated in understanding urban-rural relationships as it might. And although there is a bit of a return to urban hinterlands in the context of Silchester environs and so forth, that's moving back towards a topography and sites rather than people and artefacts. And I should also say that for me, one of the concerns, the downside, if you like, is that the sort of Cinderella of urban sites in Britain, the lesser urban sites, the secondary agglomerations, to use the anglicisation of the French terminology, small towns, minor towns, what you will, still are a fairy godmother. No one is really integrated them into overall thinking. And although information is there, it is very, very disparate. And what I wanted to do finally was just to go back to this naturalised consensus, the characterisation of towns as colonia, civitas capitals, municipia, which must be one of the few things that remains in the syllabus of most lecture courses on Roman Britain from the 1960s and 1970s. Now, there have been some interesting different approaches. John Crichton's Britannia, thinking about towns in their origins. Dominic Perring and Martin Pitts' study of relationship between town and country in Essex. And Adam Rogers' thoughts about water and urban site are three that come to mind. There are others. But for me, what I would say is I think there's a lot to celebrate in the period we're looking at. It's quite curious that not a lot of that stuff to celebrate has been seen through the lens of the journal Britannia. But at the same time, there seems to me to be a real opportunity for a lot more debate about the fundamentals of urbanism in Roman Britain. And as Britannia has moved towards a much more debate-focused journal in the last few years, I hope that going back and questioning the categorisations and the way we think about urban sites in Britain might form a focus for future debate in that splendid journal. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin. Excellent. Any questions, please, for Martin? He's got time for a couple. Yes.
I'd just like to
If you
take
could,
up...
sorry, just wait a second for the microphone, please.
You point to how since the 1990s much of urban archaeology is driven by commerce. Do you think there's any responsibility for archaeologists to try and insist that some preservation is done of those excavations so that the general public can actually see what has been achieved? Because to me this is a vital element for the future of archaeology, is that the mass of people are aware of what's being done. Just the idea that perhaps 5% or some percentage is preserved.
I'm fully supportive of the idea that we need to communicate our results much more effectively to the public. I'm very sceptical about whether preservation is the best way of doing that. And I say that as someone who spends quite a lot of my research time working in Italy, where what you dig up is preserved and presented, and you generate a massive, massive problem of preservation and presentation. And I don't think in the urban context in Britain that would be the best value for money in doing that. I think preservation is something that needs to be thought about very, very carefully and reserved for the absolutely exceptional instances.
Thank you. Any other quick questions? Okay, then I think we'll take our coffee break. We have a 20-minute break.